My name is Ching. I'm from Malaysia and I work with the Third World Network. Thank you for the opportunity to share our reflections. And I'm going to focus on resource mobilization. Obviously, it's a very important topic. And I'll focus largely on targets 18 and 19, but I wanted us to bear in mind that there is also a strategy for resource mobilization to be adopted at COP15 and ongoing discussions under the SBI. So we need to situate the GBF in this as well. The first point I wanted to make was that we need to understand resource mobilization for biodiversity within the larger context of the very deeply extractive and inequitable global economy, which is driven by wealthy and powerful elites and corporations. And this is both historical and present. While more resources are undoubtedly required to halt biodiversity loss, we must see this as not just a problem of funding, but one of structural and political and systemic political economy root causes. And by this, including governments actively subsidizing extractive and biodiversity harming industries, encouraging extractivism through trade and investment deals, austerity and debt loads on developing countries depleting public finances and impeding government action, tax evasion by wealthy elites and corporations draining public coffers, and of course, not to mention the trillions of dollars that go into harmful extractive investments by private corporations, right? Now, not only does this lead to biodiversity loss, but it continues to pose threats to IPLCs, women, and the most vulnerable. And there is an interaction with persistent inequalities, whether it's of race, gender, caste, and wealth, which not only disproportionately affect these communities more, but also then end up legitimizing and fueling further extractivism. Now, nothing in the current goals and targets of the first draft addresses these structural issues. This is a fundamental flaw. For more information, I'll point you to our report that we published earlier this year called Beyond the Gap. It's available on our website. Turning now to draft 1. Target 18 addresses harmful incentives or subsidies. And of course, these should be rightly eliminated in a just and equitable way. Now, the OECD conservatively estimated in 2020 that the flow of harmful subsidies was about $500 billion per year. This is already 5 to 6 times greater than the monetary resources flowing towards biodiversity. And more recently, of course, we've had the Dasgupta review and other studies that estimate the total global cost of subsidies that damage biodiversity at 4 to 6 trillion US dollars per year. Now, this is clearly a key issue that needs to be addressed. The failure to meet Aichi Target 3 means we cannot continue just doing the same ineffective thing. But we see that mistakes are being repeated even in this current pandemic situation. A just recently released report from Bailout Watch, Public Citizen, and Friends of the Earth, which tracks US taxpayer funds flowing to fossil fuel companies, showed that a total of $110 billion were given to 66 companies, including 10.4 to 15.2 billion US dollars in direct disbursements to coal, oil, and gas companies. Now, this is not the right way to go, we know it. And what's actually missing from Target 18 is the justice component. There's actually an urgent need to regulate finance and penalize the industries that damage biodiversity and the rights of IPLCs. This is currently absent from the target, because we know we cannot simply rely on voluntary mechanisms to just trust businesses to do the right thing. We know these have failed to drive action at the pace or scale necessary. And in addition to regulation, the target should also compel governments to disclose subsidies, as identifying harmful subsidies is the first step to eliminating them. Target 18 also talks about incentives that are, sorry, I can't change the slide. Yeah, there we go. Target 18 also talks about incentives that are neutral or positive for biodiversity. And if we look at the one-pager drafted by the co-chairs, there's some examples provided, but there's also a note indicating that there is interest in payment for ecosystem services, or PES. But research, however, shows that market-based approaches like PES are not a major new source of funding for biodiversity. Some schemes don't even include biodiversity at all. And for the very few biodiversity payment for ecosystem services schemes, they actually show very narrow scope and uncertain results. And what the experience has shown that the programs that have been most successful have actually integrated local traditions and institutions with strong representation of local values and knowledge and equitable benefit sharing. Now, this points to a strong role for governments in prioritizing equity objectives, putting in place locally appropriate and robust safeguards against market risks, and governance arrangements that empower IPLCs, integrate local knowledge, and recognize IPLC rights. Now, these aspects are missing again from the current target. While target 19 to increase financial resources is welcome, the quantums are still too low, especially if we consider the trillions that are flowing to biodiversity harmful incentives. 200 billion, 10 billion earmarked for developing countries. These are extremely low figures. Now, of course, we know Article 20 of the CBD refers to parties' common but differentiated responsibilities, the obligation of developed countries to provide new and additional financial resources to enable developing countries to effectively implement the CBD. This obligation has not been met. Now, then when we consider the ecological and climate debts that rich industrialized countries have accrued over the last 500 years through their overuse of the world's resources, and to make matters worse, the extractive economic development has social and environmental costs that we know fall disproportionately upon IPLCs, smallholder producers, women, and people of color. Yet, importantly, the evidence consistently shows that it is IPLCs who are effectively conserving and sustainably using biodiversity. Now, this is a glaring gap in the current target 19. It is completely silent on the need for resources to be channeled to support ongoing stewardship by IPLCs and to protect their rights so that they can continue autonomously safeguarding biodiversity. And I encourage you to read this briefing put out by the Forest Peoples Programs that illustrates and explains this very clearly. Finally, my last point, referring to target 19 again, is with regard to the phrase leveraging private finance. Now, this is based on a claim that the public sector cannot provide the finances needed. Therefore, there's a need for private sector financing. This is really about blended finance, the use of public, philanthropic, or supranational funding to leverage or unlock or catalyze private investments. But the track record of private for-profit biodiversity finance shows that flows are actually small and pose risks to livelihoods and rights, with examples of dispossessions of IPLC. There's a risk of private gains and social losses, as blended finance merely guarantees the incomes of investors and investment bankers, rather than peoples and nature. So instead of leveraging private finance, Target 19 should rather point to other ways of mobilizing public funds and establishing policies that disincentivize environmental degradation in the first place. Now, if we address structural barriers that countries face, and by this I mean debt, austerity, and tax avoidance, there will be adequate public funds. I'll just throw out some figures. For example, Fortune 500 companies have an estimated 2.3 trillion in tax havens. And this costs governments 500 to 600 billions a year. The loss to lower income economies is about 200 billion a year. And this totally eclipses development assistance. Developing countries' debt is around $11 trillion, with debt service payments at 3.4 trillion annually. Just imagine how multilateral tax reform and sovereign debt restructuring and forgiveness in line with CBD objectives would allow governments to prioritize investments in biodiversity, as well as pandemic recovery that is just and sustainable. So I'll stop here. These are some of our proposals and ideas that perhaps go beyond the traditional limits or parameters that when we talk about resource mobilization. But these are really important principles and issues, systemic issues that we feel do have to be addressed if we are really to see resources flow to biodiversity and to the peoples who conserve and sustainably use biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Let me get my screen up here and I'll go right into it. You should see the screen now. 5 minutes to do DSI is a bit of a challenge, but I'll do my best to hit some of the high points. The subtitle of the, well, let me say this. In the course of doing many presentations on DSI and participating in many conversations about it over the last few years, you frequently get the reaction that it sounds like a really fascinating issue, but it's something that's very hard to wrap your head around. I've recently come upon this notion of datafication, and it may be helpful for people in sort of putting together their thoughts about what's going on with DSI, and that's that.
Sorry to interrupt you, Edward. Could you slow down?
Slow down, sure. And that's really that we all know now that all of our clicks and all of our likes and all of our activity online and interactions are being collected and going into databases. And in a sense, the same process is happening with biodiversity through the mass sequencing of all types of organisms and subsequent use of big data and artificial intelligence techniques to analyze that information. So if that may be a helpful concept to you, that biodiversity in a sense is being datafied in the same way that many other things that we're more familiar with in our lives we know have been. The problem with DSI is really quite straightforward and significant. You know, in the first human genome that was sequenced, took 13 years and what would now be over US $5 billion and 20 laboratories. Today, you can have your genome sequenced in a few days for $300 US. Initially, in order to sequence an organism, even a very small organisms like a bacteria, in the 1990s, shortly after the CBD was negotiated and as it was coming into force, it would require rooms full of very expensive equipment. Today, many of those functions can be completed by a $900 USB stick. In the beginning, we talked about sequencing single genomes in the sense of one individual from a species being somehow representative of all the diversity of that species. Not anymore. And now, particularly in the context of the pandemic, we're talking seriously about sequencing a very large proportion of the individuals from any given species. And we've also, in the sense of the depth, we've evolved not only in the depth of sequencing that's conducted on individual species, but also obviously in the breadth of organisms. Back in 1995, when the CBD was meeting in Jakarta, in COP2, there was exactly one organism, one bacteria in the world that had been sequenced. Today, we're talking about, with projects like the Earth Biogenome Project, attempting to sequence every organism on the face of the Earth. So this is a tremendous transformation that's occurred during the lifetime of the CBD. The process on digital sequence information emerged from the ATEG on synthetic biology that took place in 2015. I'm not going to run through the whole cycle that you can see in the slide, but I just want to point out a couple of important things about it. Back in Sharm el-Sheikh and at COP14, an important event happened. And that was many developing countries, and Africa in particular, linked resolution of fair and equitable benefit sharing for digital sequence information to adoption of the global agenda. And this link continues, and this is why the digital sequence information agenda item is on the open-ended working group. Discussion on DSI has also been made more difficult, and it's been delayed by the pandemic, like a lot of things. Over the last couple of years, the only substantive discussions that have been had are informal, and that's through the DSI dialogue group, which has taken on perhaps a bit more profile than it would have under normal circumstances. But the overriding point here is that, one, there's a large group of countries that have strongly linked developing a fair and equitable solution to DSI to adoption of the agenda. And two, that this is not really a new issue now. It's been around since 2015, and there has been scant serious formal discussion of it. And it's something that we really, and part of that is the result of a pandemic, but not all of that. And the pressure is really mounting because the technology is moving faster and faster to come up with a solution. And now my final slide is just to talk about a few key points in the negotiation. So what's happening now is that enormous troves of the sequence information of organisms across the planet are being put together. In fact, they're being put together faster than anyone knows how to use them. This is another thing that's a parallel a bit to data science in other areas. We're creating a lot of data of a lot of things right now faster than we're able to interpret it. But a key aspect of what's happening with the acquisition and use of DSI is that there are intrinsic elements to the way DSI is used that are not particularly amenable to a bilateral approach to access and benefit sharing. But it's important to say that that doesn't mean that it's impossible. Track and trace is possible. There are ways to do access and benefit sharing for digital sequence information on a bilateral basis, but the ways in which DSI are used make that difficult. So the ideal world that I think many people that are working in this would like to see is that of a multilateral comprehensive solution that can deal with both the aggregate value of DSI, meaning the insights that come from analyzing tens or hundreds of thousands of sequences, and the individual value of DSI, because there are still individual genes and forms of genes that can be incredibly valuable. Another point here is that the significance of this phenomenon has to be, the economic significance of this phenomenon has to be fully recognized. The value of DSI is no longer in doubt. And if you do still doubt it, all you have to do is look at COVID vaccines. Essentially, all COVID vaccines are reliant on DSI, some to a greater degree than others. Many of the licensed COVID vaccines are very highly reliant on DSI, would not exist without it. And all future COVID vaccines will be reliant on a global effort to collect organisms, to sequence them, and to make that information available. Well, just for this one organism, then, you're talking about a DSI-derived value of tens of billions of dollars a year. So what we're talking about here is not a small benefit sharing program to make databases and sequencers available to people in developing countries. There's a major economic value associated with DSI, and that value is escaping traditional approaches to access and benefit sharing that are based upon a physical transfer of materials and national access laws. Two final points with respect to what I think is very important in the upcoming DSI negotiation. One is that the open access paradigm, open access databases in biology simply cannot continue to do business the way that they're doing now. We may be able to keep something that we call open access, but it is impossible for open access to continue to be a situation wherein everything is uploaded to a database that anyone, particularly corporations, have access to, and they are free to use that information however they want to. This situation cannot continue to exist. And that causes friction in the corporate and in academic and in various areas, because they become accustomed to this free access to DSI, but access to DSI and open access databases must be made subject to terms and conditions that require benefit sharing in the event of commercial use. And this is going to be one of the key points of the negotiation. Finally, if we are successful in developing a multilateral benefit sharing system, what should it support? And here I would submit that, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a question of facilitating access to technology to developing countries so much, though that may be part of it. But I think that there is a perception among some in the North that the benefit sharing system for DSI is going to be to replicate the DSI analytics and systems in developing countries. Well, perhaps that's part, but the real one, I think, is to support IPLCs in their development and maintenance of their own knowledge systems. Because we know, as one of the few bright spots as you look around in biodiversity conservation around the world, is that territories that are under the control of IPLCs tend to be surviving in a more intact state than others. And rather than looking upon traditional knowledge as something to extract and to insert into our own sort of extractive information system, we should look to be supporting the continued maintenance and development of traditional knowledge systems. And that should be really where the benefit sharing should be directed, that comes out of what we would hope to be a multilateral benefit sharing system with significant benefit sharing that is really linked to the scale of the commercial profits that are being made from DSI.